January 15, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The cold, salt wind carved through the ruins of Yokosuka Naval Base as Captain Minoru Genda stood among the skeletal remains of what had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His breath formed small clouds in the winter air, disappearing as quickly as the dreams of invincibility that had fueled his nation's war machine. Before him, twisted steel beams jutted from the harbor like broken bones, the charred hulls of destroyers listing in shallow water, half-submerged monuments to a dying empire. The silence was total. No hammering of rivets, no shouts of dock workers, no roar of aircraft engines, only the lapping of oily water against concrete and the distant cry of gulls circling over a graveyard. This was not how it was supposed to end. For years earlier, on December 7, 1941, Genda himself had helped architect the attack on Pearl Harbor, a masterpiece of tactical daring that had announced Japan's arrival as a Pacific superpower. The Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, had crossed 3,000 miles of ocean undetected and delivered what Japanese military planners believed would be a knockout blow to American naval power. In the Imperial General Headquarters, champagne flowed. In the streets of Tokyo, citizens celebrated beneath rising sun flags. Japan had secured what called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vast domain of conquered territory stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of India. The Americans, Japanese strategists assured themselves, would sue for peace within 6 months. They were a soft people, addicted to luxury, incapable of sustained sacrifice. Their democracy was weakness. Their abundance made them lazy. Their multiracial society would fracture under pressure. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned otherwise. Having studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, he alone seemed to grasp what Japan had awakened. In a letter to Navy Minister Oikawa Koshiro written weeks after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto confessed a creeping dread. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His colleagues dismissed this as defeatism. They had not seen what Yamamoto had seen in America: the endless miles of factories in Detroit, the forest of oil derricks in Texas, the grain elevators rising like cathedrals across the Midwest. They did not understand that America's abundance was not a symptom of weakness, but the foundation of incomprehensible industrial might. The first cracks in Japanese confidence appeared not in battle, but in captured supplies. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japanese sailors who boarded the damaged American carrier Yorktown before it sank reported something that disturbed naval intelligence more than a tactical defeat: the quality and quantity of provisions aboard a single American warship. Refrigerated compartments held tons of fresh meat, vegetables, and dairy. The crew's mess served hot coffee around the clock. Individual sailors possessed spare uniforms, toiletries, and personal items in abundance. A single American carrier held more food stores than a Japanese battleship group. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto, in his recovered diary, wrote, "If this is how they provision one ship, how could we possibly match an entire fleet? Our men eat fish and rice. Theirs eat like emperors." But it was in the jungles of Guadalcanal where the ideological foundation of Japanese superiority began to collapse entirely. From August 1942 through February 1943, Japanese forces fought to hold Henderson Field against American Marines in what would become a decisive campaign. Japanese soldiers, conditioned by Bushido to value spiritual strength over material comfort, expected to face enemies softened by American prosperity. Instead, they encountered Marines supplied with a logistics network so vast it defied comprehension. While Japanese soldiers subsisted on rice balls and, as supplies dwindled, tree bark and insects, American forces received 3 hot meals daily. Sear ration cans bore labels in English advertising beef hash, pork and beans, and chocolate bars. Medical supplies flowed continuously. Ammunition seemed limitless. Most disturbing of all were the luxury items: cigarettes, chewing gum, magazines, and even Coca-Cola, shipped 8,000 miles across the Pacific to be distributed to enlisted men in a jungle combat zone. Sergeant Hajime Kobayashi, captured in January 1943, told his interrogators something that appeared in classified intelligence reports. "We fought for the Emperor's honor. We expected to die. But you Americans fight as if death is optional. You bring your entire country with you, your factories, your farms, your very way of life. How can samurai spirit defeat this? We sharpen swords. You multiply bullets. It is not warfare. It is mathematics. The mathematics were indeed devastating. In 1943, American shipyards launched more tonnage than the entire Japanese merchant marine. A single facility, Kaiser Permanente's Richmond Shipyard No. 2, could complete a Liberty ship in an average of 42 days. At peak production, American factories produced one aircraft every 5 minutes. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford Motor Company, featured an assembly line nearly a mile long producing 24 Liberator bombers at a rate that would have seemed like science fiction to Japanese industrialists. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft production, hampered by material shortages, decentralized manufacturing, and lack of standardization, peaked at just over 28,000 units in 1944, a year when America produced 96,318. Japanese propaganda tried desperately to reframe this disparity. Newsreels in Tokyo cinemas showed Japanese pilots as spiritual warriors whose devotion compensated for inferior numbers. Radio broadcasts emphasized American casualties, framing every lost bomber as proof of Japanese resistance. But soldiers returning from the front told different stories in private. They spoke of skies blackened by American aircraft, of naval bombardments so intense the jungle itself seemed to ignite, of wounded Americans evacuated by helicopter, while Japanese wounded died untreated in caves. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Japan's entire military doctrine rested on the belief that spiritual purity, discipline, and willingness to die could overcome material disadvantage. Reality was proving otherwise. Nowhere was this more evident than in the air campaign. By 1944, American B-29 superfortresses began systematic bombing raids against Japanese cities from bases in the Mariana Islands. These aircraft, technological marvels featuring pressurized cabins, remote-control gun turrets, and a range to strike Tokyo from Saipan, represented everything Japanese industry could not produce. Each B-29 cost $639,000, more than most Japanese regional factories. The March 9, 10, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 civilians and destroyed 16 square miles of city in a single night. Survivors describe a vision of industrial apocalypse. Waves of bombers so numerous they blotted out the stars, releasing cascades of incendiary bombs that created firestorms reaching temperatures of 1,800 degrees. The attack employed 1,665 tons of ordnance, more explosive power than Japan's entire monthly ammunition production. In the rubble, survivors found American incendiary cluster bombs still intact, their casings stamped with manufacturer marks: Douglas Aircraft, Monsanto Chemical, Standard Oil. Even in destruction, the bombs were symbols of American industrial omnipotence. Each bomb was a sermon on productivity, a metal testament to the democracy that Japanese militarists had called decadent. How could a soft nation produce such terrible abundance? How could a society devoted to individual pleasure generate such collective power? The final answer came not in battle, but in silent comprehension. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast used language carefully chosen to preserve dignity while acknowledging the unbridgeable gap. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. The power which to do damage is indeed incalculable. Should we continue to fight, it would result not only in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. What the emperor could not say explicitly, but what every Japanese soldier and civilian understood, was that the atomic bomb was merely the ultimate expression of what they had faced throughout the war, an enemy whose resources were so vast, whose industrial capacity was so overwhelming, that resistance was not heroic. It was mathematical impossibility. The atomic bomb did not represent a new kind of warfare. It represented the logical conclusion of American abundance applied to destruction. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu climbed the battleship's ladder to sign the instrument of surrender. The Missouri itself was a symbol carefully chosen by General Douglas MacArthur, a 58,000-ton embodiment of American naval power, its decks crowded with representatives of the allied nations Japan had sought to conquer. As Shigemitsu signed, his hands reportedly trembling, he sat beneath the ship's massive 16-inch guns. Above him, the flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had flown when his black ships first opened Japan to the west in 1853 hung as a deliberate historical echo. But perhaps the most profound symbol that day was invisible. While the surrender ceremony proceeded, American sailors aboard the Missouri were preparing lunch: pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and ice cream for dessert. The galleys served it on metal trays, unremarkably, the way it served every meal. Around the harbor, on dozens of American ships, identical meals were being prepared for thousands of sailors. It was abundance, so routine it was beneath comment. Yet this single meal, multiplied across the fleet, represented more food than most Japanese civilians had seen in months. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and stood aboard the Missouri as a witness to surrender, later wrote in his memoir, "We learned that day that we had not lost American soldiers. We had lost American factories, American farms, American oil wells. We lost a nation that could feed its warriors and its civilians, that could produce both butter and guns in quantities that made our total mobilization look like poverty. We lost a democracy not because it made men weak, but because it made nations rich." In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, this lesson became foundation. The same industrial might that had produced bombers and battleships now produced food aid and construction materials. General MacArthur's reformation of Japan was, in essence, an invitation to join the system that had defeated them, to exchange militarism for commerce, conquest for trade, empire for partnership within an American-led economic order. The irony was not lost on Japanese intellectuals. They fought to establish Asian prosperity against Western imperialism, only to achieve prosperity by accepting American hegemony. The silence that Captain Genda had heard in Yokosuka Naval Base in January 1945 was not merely the silence of defeat. It was the sound of an entire ideological framework collapsing. For 50 years, since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had pursued modernization through military expansion, believing that power flowed from territorial conquest and spiritual discipline. The war against America revealed a different truth. In the modern age, power flows from industrial capacity, and industrial capacity flows from systems, economic, political, social, that maximize productivity. Democracy, for all its apparent chaos, was simply more efficient at generating wealth than militarism. Abundance was not weakness, but the foundation of invincible strength. Tokyo's silence yielded not just American military might, but to the terrible revelation that everything Japan's leaders had believed about power, strength, and national greatness was wrong. The samurai spirit, facing production statistics and tonnage counts, was simply insufficient. Bushido could not sink ships that outnumbered Japanese vessels 4-1. Willingness to die meaninglessly when confronted with enemies who possessed both the will to fight and the resources to replace every loss. And so Japan stood silent, not in the silence of meditation, but in the silence of understanding. The great transformation was complete. The warriors who had expected to conquer Asia through superior spirit instead learned that the modern world belonged to those who could turn iron into steel, steel into machines, and machines into the daily bread of 150 million citizens. America's might was not in its weapons, but in the civilization that produced weapons as a byproduct of producing everything else. The epilogue was written not in surrender documents, but in the subsequent peace. Within a generation, Japan would become the world's second-largest economy, its automobiles and electronics filling American homes, its rebuilt cities symbols of prosperity rather than conquest. The silence that fell over Tokyo in 1945 was the last silence of the old world. What rose from the ruins was something new, a nation that learned, through terrible experience, that abundance defeats scarcity, that systems triumph over spirit, and that the future belongs not to those willing to die for an emperor, but to those capable of living prosperously under the complex, compromising, infinitely productive machinery of democratic capitalism. The wind still blows across Tokyo Bay. The water still laps at concrete. But the silence is gone. replaced by the hum of container ships, the roar of jets overhead, the electric buzz of a city that learned America's lesson and made its own. This is how empires truly fall. Not in fire and blood, though there was both, but in the quiet moment when the defeated finally understand why they lost and begin, grudgingly at first, to imitate their conquerors.